Welcome to the first episode of Recovery Rockstars. My name is Melinda Lussier. I'm a person in long-term recovery from addiction and drugs. And we are starting a series. It's going to be a monthly series. We're really excited that people are going to be able to hear about the journeys of others that have struggled with addiction, opioid use disorder, substance use disorder, and have found a way out, and they're here to be able to share their stories to bring hope to our community. Unless anybody's been living under a rock, we all know that the drug epidemic has continued to increase. The overdoses and fatalities have continued to increase. In 2010, we had 75 overdoses in the state of Vermont, according to the Vermont Department of Health. In 2013, we were looking at 109, and in 2016, 148. Those numbers continue to increase, and yet we are working together to bring a solution and decrease those numbers. And one of the key pieces of the solution is knowing that there's hope, knowing that there's people who have traveled this journey, who have found a better way of life, and who are willing to share that message. Another thing that we look at are having those overdoses. We need to be equipped with Narcan opioid overdose kits. And the distribution of those kits has continued to increase. They're very easily accessible. There are 2 pilot sites in Franklin County at the turning point of Franklin County, as well as the Howard Center. After the show, we'll be providing contact information for those kits. But in the meantime, I just want to stress how essential it is for every community member out there to get an overdose kit, regardless of who you know or who you may think that you know that would never overdose. It could be a stranger that you would be chosen to save their lives. It's better to have a kit and never need to use it than to need a kit and not have it on you. So I encourage people to reach out and get familiar with your recovery supports, and we will share more about that later. But right now, I'm going to be introducing a dear friend of mine, fellow in recovery, Hal Porter, who's here to share his experience, strength, and hope with you. Hal, I'm going to start by asking you to share a little bit about what it was like getting into drug addiction and alcohol addiction.
Oh, first of all, thank you for asking me, Melinda.
Thank you for accepting.
My journey into drug addiction, I grew up in St. Albans. Family moved here when I was very young, and like a normal kid, had a lot of time on my hand, and my substance use started as something to do with your friends, as a social event.
Pure boredom?
Yeah, pretty much. It was hanging out with friends, and I believe my first experience with a substance, I was about 9, 10 years old, which was marijuana. And, by the time I was 12, 13, it was pretty much a daily event. Alcohol came into my life when I was about 15. And I say that not that I didn't have sips of alcohol here and there earlier, but it was my first experience with alcohol where I consumed enough to feel the effects of it. And high school was a blur. It was, experimenting with everything and anything. And if I liked it, I did it. I did it to the point where I either physically couldn't do it anymore or I didn't have the means to get anymore. So,
how did you access it? When you look back on your high school years and your younger years, how did you access marijuana? How did you access alcohol?
That's a great question. I don't want to disclose my age too much, but when I was in high school, believe it or not, the legal drinking age in Vermont was still 18. Yeah. So to acquire alcohol was not a difficult task. It wasn't too hard to find somebody that was 18 that would be willing to purchase that. Sorry, Mom. When I was about 13 or 14, my mother came to me and basically said, I don't care if you smoke marijuana, leave mine alone. And I grew up in the 70s, and to get marijuana was not a hard feat. Right. It was on the tail end of the hippie era, and right. I remember as a kid growing up, there was nothing wrong with people smoking marijuana. It was like drinking alcohol.
So it was like the norm.
It was the norm.
So as time goes on, when you look at the history of when you first became familiar with substances, and then when you saw it starting to escalate and cause trouble, what did that look like?
Well, my first experience with that was, for most folks, it takes 4 years to graduate high school. I turned 18 at the very beginning of the senior year, and I was working pretty much full-time and drinking full-time. And by the time halfway through the school season, I was pulled into the dean's office, and he pretty much said, you know, even if you come to school, even if you ace your classes, it's not a priority. And he was right. You know, school was not on my priority list.
Got in the way of the partying, right?
Exactly. They gave me the option that, you know, if I wanted to come back and continue my education and get my diploma, then that was available to me, which I ended up doing. But that was really the first sign of, you know, my substances getting in the way and having some definite negative consequences on my life.
So when you look at like that point, so you're looking at like the high school years, a little bit after, and we know that alcoholism and addiction, it's a progressive disease. So it continues to progress despite whether we're picking up or we've put it down.
Right.
So when you look and fast forward a little bit on some of the more damaging outcomes, so when did you see things spiraling where you were convinced that not only is it a priority, but it's not really partying anymore? There's a dependency that comes into the picture. What did that look like for you?
For me, that point in my life came when pain medication, opiates, came in my life. You know, part of the reason why I went back to finish up my last year in BFA and to graduate is because I enrolled in the delay entry program in the military. I enlisted in the Army. And during basic training, I had found out that I had some issues with my left knee. Fast forward to 2000, I find myself in a doctor's office, you know, having some issues with my left knee, and before I know it, I'm being prescribed fairly large amounts of pain medication and being treated for chronic pain. And in the beginning, it was, you know, try to take them as prescribed, but, you know, part of my progressiveness and my disease is that, you know, if 2's good, then 4's better, and I'm going to take 6, and, you know, because I don't want to feel pain. And unfortunately, as that progressed, you know, a lot of negative consequences came into my life. And, you know, I hear people share from time to time that, you know, at the end of that journey before they embark in recovery, that they lose everything.
Right.
And I used to be one of those people that would say, I lost everything. And, you know, in recovery, looking back on it, I didn't lose anything. I freely gave it all away. Yeah. And it wasn't that it wasn't important, but it wasn't important enough because my addiction had taken over my life, and it really ruled my life and you know, the decisions that I made.
Do you find, like, so we hear a lot about tolerance, and of course you and I firsthand have experienced this, where in the beginning, maybe taking a couple of pills, we would feel it. As time goes on, it takes 4, it takes 8, it takes 20 sometimes in a pop, 30, 40. So do you feel like not only were you not getting the effect that you were seeking, but you could never quite get it again, like get that high, and it was just trying to not be sick? Did you experience that
yeah,
withdrawal?
definitely.
What was that like, realizing that you could not get through a day without a substance? What did that look like?
In the progression of my addiction, you know, I would take or overtake these medications, these substances, to escape from normal, escape from reality, to not feel, not deal with issues going on in my life. And unfortunately, what ends up happening is that that twisted reality becomes the norm. That thing that I was searching to escape now becomes my norm. For me personally, I truly believe for the last couple of years that I was using these substances, it wasn't because I was getting the effect, it was because that was my norm.
Right.
And that I was addicted to these substances because of the physical addiction. And if I didn't take these substances, then I wasn't gonna physically feel well enough to take care of any other responsibilities in my life.
So when you look at becoming, it starts with tinkering around with it, partying, having fun with it, boredom, then the disease starts progressing, and then it's almost requiring you to take it. And then it gets to a point that you are required, that we can't function without something in the morning to help us get through the day. What did it look like for you when you essentially hit your bottom and decided that you needed to seek help for your addiction?
The funny thing about that is I didn't get into recovery seeking recovery. Back in 2008, there was a substance that started to come into our community that doctors were treating people for opiate addiction, and that substance was buprenorphine or Suboxone. And when my prescription wouldn't last me a month, I would seek that out in order to get me to the next month when I could refill the prescription. So ultimately, I ended up getting kicked off the pain medication, and I figured, well, I had a doctor prescribing this pain medication all this time. I would get a doctor to prescribe me this maintenance drug. So that was, in the very beginning, my motivator to go to inpatient rehab, because back in 2008, unlike today, in order to get on a maintenance drug, that you had to basically do an inpatient rehab. And in 2008, that was my first trip to Maple Leaf Farm. Mm-hmm. What I discovered is that, I did have choices, and I could change things to live my life differently. But in the beginning, my motivation was not necessarily recovery, but the substance to make my life better, or so I could not go through withdrawal.
And it's interesting too, because I think of a lot of reports that I look at data to track why do people go to treatment. When the outcomes show us that some people are successful and some aren't, there's actually a pretty high number of people that go with the intention of nothing more than to get the partner off their back, get the parents off their back, get law enforcement, PNP off their back, and they actually are able to obtain recovery once they get there, because they hear things. So what did you hear at Maple Leaf that shifted? And if I'm not mistaken, it wasn't maybe your first trip there that something shifted, but more so your second trip. What did you hear or see that made you realize you wanted more than just another drug?
One of the things that they have in recovery is that nothing changes if nothing changes. And to a certain degree, for me, I was able to obtain obtain a primary care physician, and I was able to get on the maintenance program, but nothing else really kind of changed in my life. I was still, actively acting out in the same old behaviors, hanging out with the same people, the same crowd. So ultimately, within a handful of months, I was kicked off the maintenance program. And that was a big motivator for me to go back to inpatient treatment. And my decision is that I didn't want to be held to this substance anymore. That, this time when I went back to Maple Leaf Farm in 2009, I went there for recovery. That I wanted to live my life differently. And when I was there, they call it a moment of clarity, the gift of desperation. put any kind of title or name on it that you want. For me, it was ultimate surrender. It was me understanding that self-reliance, self-will, me trying to dictate what my recovery was going to look like and what I was going to do, you know, or Hal knows what's good for Hal, when over the span of my life, my actions clearly dictated at times I had no idea what was good for Hal. But that moment of ultimate surrender, I realized that this was something that I couldn't do by myself. You know, I had a lifetime of making really bad decisions, hurting people I loved, hurting myself, and I could do that all by myself. But to, you know, get clean and sober and live my life clean and sober, I couldn't do that by myself, and I needed help to do that. And that was really a turning point for me in my recovery, because all those things that I was so reluctant to do the first time, all of a sudden now I became willing to do. For me, the first year in my recovery really was, okay, I'll try.
Right.
Because for me, I had nothing left. You know, at that point, it was either try or go back to where I came from, and I just did not want to go back to where my life was before. So
I like how you mentioned too, like you recognize that it's nothing that one person can do alone. It takes support, it takes others. That whole I can't, but we can.
yes.
And if I'm not mistaken, because I hear you quote it often in a lot of different gatherings that we go to, there's only one thing you have to change, and that's everything, right? So when you came out of treatment and you surrendered, you know, we saw a little where you talked a little bit about the journey and getting there and basically losing everything, being depleted. Giving treatment a half a shot, half measures brought you back around to go a second time, and then you had the ultimate surrender. So when you look at what happened once you got out of inpatient treatment, what changed and what happened to keep you accountable? What did you draw on for your supports and your accountability?
I actually drew on a couple of different supports. I think one of the more important aspects, especially early in recovery, and I was very fortunate in that aspect, was having a safe home. Having a living situation where at the end of the day, regardless of what's going on, you can feel safe and secure. Because as I had mentioned earlier, you know, the three big things that I had to change in my life was people, places, and things.
Right.
And that was a huge asset. You know, at the time we have the Turning Point Center here in St. Albans now, and that wasn't around when I got into recovery in 2009. So we had a 12-step community. I attended some groups up at the Howard Center, which is, I did for a long time, was a huge part of my recovery as well, and the people and staff up there. But I also, I engulfed myself into the 12-step community. You know, I worked really hard. I went to a lot of meetings, and that became my new support and social network. You know, that in many ways, the fellowship showed me how to be a person again, how to communicate with other people. And because one of the things about addiction is the isolation.
Yeah.
And
get bad advice when you isolate, don't you?
Exactly,
I know I do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And you know, we lose those social skills in our addiction, and how to communicate with others, and how to, you know, be a friend, be a part of society and part of our communities. We lose sight of that in our addiction. And by being involved in the fellowship allowed me to relearn how to do all those things and to grow and build self-confidence, you know, and self-esteem, which were all depleted, you know.
That's a biggie too. I hear that so much, and I know for me, seeking recovery, I often would say I have no self-esteem. How do you fix it? Well, you do esteemable things. So we talk about that. We tell our sponsees or people we're trying to help, go open the door at the grocery store. And if it's electronics, step on the thing, carry somebody's bags. So what do you feel were some of the things that help you gain that esteem? Like, I know you had service positions and responsibilities that kept you accountable. What did that look like?
Yeah, very early on, it was suggested to me that, you know, that I join a group and get a service commitment. You know, my sobriety date is in August 8th, and I can remember having my first clean and sober Christmas, sitting at my mother's house at the dinner table, and actually at the end of the meal, I had to excuse myself because I had made a commitment to go open up and set up for the meeting that night. Mm-hmm. And it was things like that held me accountable. Yeah. You know, I'd been letting myself down most of my life, and the last thing I wanted to do was let these people down.
Right, right.
And, you know, there was having that service commitment, I can talk myself out of doing anything. But having the fellowship and the people in my group hold me accountable when at times I can't hold myself accountable was huge. Yeah. Was huge. And it still is today, you know.
So when you look at what it was like, what got you into wanting a lifestyle of recovery, and what it's like today, first, like kind of on a personal level, what are some of the things that you've accomplished since you've been in recovery that you never would have even imagined tackling before you got into recovery?
I will first start with, there was a couple of things that were very huge for me early in recovery, and a lot of that was reconnecting with my family, with my children. I can share with you that it had been almost 4 years since I had any contact with my family or my children, and the fear of reaching out to them and not knowing whether or not they were going to reject me or take me almost crippled me to the point where I wouldn't even try. But I did try, and you know, it was the support of, you know, the people in the fellowship in recovery that gave me the strength to be able to reach out and do that. You know, a couple other things. 3 years ago, a little over 3 years ago, I was working at a job and I was let go from that job. And I remember that morning that I got let go from the job, I went home and I made two phone calls. The first one was Department of Unemployment and Training, and I filed for unemployment. And the second one was to Community College of Vermont, CCV. And I enrolled in at CCV, and that summer, in June, I started summer semester, and as of last June, I graduated at CCV with my associate's degree in human services and a substance abuse certificate. You know, it amazes me because it took me 5 years to get through high school. That's
what I was kind of hoping would be highlighted.
And I graduated with a GPA 3.8.
Unbelievable.
And to say it even now amazes me. Right. You know, they say early on in recovery that, you know, in recovery anything is possible. And it truly is. Anything is possible.
So what would you say when we're, you know, trying to share this message of hope, and I would hope that anybody who's been listening is able to see what it was like, how you got here, what's happened now. And oftentimes I know back when we were, you know, still in the dark, we'd hear all these great stories and think, yeah, that could never happen for me, but we know it does. Yeah. What would be, you know, one or two things that you would want to leave people that are listening to know that, first off, we know the disease doesn't discriminate. There's nobody who is immune to, you know, developing the disease of addiction or alcoholism, substance use disorder. That being said, there's nobody immune to this solution. So what would you say for pebbles of hope?
A couple of things, you know, like myself, don't give up on failures, even though they're not failures. One of the things that I've learned in recovery is, you know, it may take many times, you know, and that any time that you feel there's a setback or a failure, in actuality, that's progress. And don't give up, you know, never give up, because the minute you give up, the disease is won. No matter how difficult it may seem or how unsurmountable it may seem at the time, if you give up, you lose. Yeah. You know, and unfortunately, one of the things that I think it's very important to highlight, and as you mentioned some of the statistics in the very beginning, is the disease kills us. Yeah. Ultimately, this disease will kill us, and if you give up, you basically have signed your death certificate. It may not be tomorrow, but when you lose, you die.
And that's something I love that you said too, so you never give up. And that's one of my favorite things to tell people is, like, we win. We never lose. We either win or we learn something. And having that mentality, because it's hard with some of the perspectives that we had back in our using days, but yet in the life of being in recovery, we never win. Even if it's painful, or I'm sorry, we never lose. Even if it's painful, that doesn't mean we've lost. It just means we're learning something. Exactly. And I think that's the key thing for people to take away.
And the other important thing is you cannot do this by yourself.
Yeah, amen, brother.
You know, I can't cure a thinking problem with thinking, right. Especially my thinking. Yeah. You know, asking for help is probably one of the hardest things to do early in recovery. To admit that I need help is one of the hardest things to accept. But once you've done that, you really have broken through that first barrier, yeah. To say, I can't, can you help me? And then once that happens, it's just being diligent about it.
And that's one thing, you know, thank you so much, Hal. I'm so excited that you accepted to come on the show and to share some of your experience.
It's always my pleasure.
And that's something that we're going to really try to make sure that we're sharing with other people who are watching and listening is, you're not alone. There's people who have gone through this. There are so many amazing resources in our community and our state. And some of the resources that we'll be trying to highlight are the Turning Point of Franklin County for recovery service support. And that's not only for people that are struggling with addiction and alcoholism, that's for the family members and the friends to get a perspective and to get a supporting ear. There's also the Howard Center, and you mentioned how helpful that was to get that intensive outpatient care, the counseling, the groups, that support. It's so essential, especially in early recovery. And in Franklin County, we have a hub that locally came to Franklin County, the BART Clinic, which is on Main Street. We've got a number of different spokes, the Northwestern Medical Center Comprehensive Pain Clinic. We've got the SWAT and Notch. There's so many different supports, NCSS. I encourage anybody who is looking for help to go to the Vermont Department of Health website, go to the Turning Point website, go to the Howard Center, go to the Vermont Recovery Network website, look up the different resources and reach out. Vermont 211. Just that one call and you can be connected with the different services. So I encourage anybody who's looking for assistance to reach out. It's never too late. And we thank you so much for watching. This is the first of many episodes. We're really excited to start sharing some messages of hope to our community. Thank you.